Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jalen Jones. North Carolina election officials have faced intense scrutiny in recent weeks. It was over recounts in a closely watched Republican primary between State Senator Phil Berger and Rockingham County Sheriff Sam Page. In a conversation on our YouTube page, WRAL state government reporters broke down what we learned about the accuracy of elections in North Carolina and the process used to verify the count. They also break down what comes next for the state budget negotiations and other big policy debates that could dominate the rest of 2026. Here's that conversation.
Welcome to On the Record. I'm Paul Specht, WRAL state government reporter, here with other WRAL state government reporter Will Doran, and we're here to talk about the saga that we didn't think would end that surprisingly ended this week.
It was much cleaner resolution than honestly I think anybody expected there to be to this.
Right. The most closely watched race in the state between North Carolina Senate leader Phil Berger and his opponent, Rockingham County Sheriff Sam Page. Why is this a big deal? Well, it's because Phil Berger is one of the two most powerful people in the state, and he's been there since 2011. And if you ever wanted a bill to pass through the North Carolina General Assembly, you had to go through him.
Yeah.
And he was seen as this towering figure. I mean, he accomplished a lot as Senate leader, whether it was cutting taxes, cutting regulations, pushing through bills that, touch on abortion and other culture war issues that Republicans care about. There's not too much he didn't get done from a Republican perspective.
Yeah, anything you can think of he did for the GOP pretty much.
There's a couple of bills related to loosening gun laws, I think, that maybe people wanted passed that didn't ultimately pass.
Constitutional carry is really the only one that I can think of.
That's the only one still lingering. But otherwise, I mean, he is arguably the most accomplished Republican legislator of all time in our state, which is saying something. And he lost by 23 votes, and the margin was so close that we thought it would play out over weeks with recounts and challenges to the eligibility of voters and perhaps even lawsuits over how these ballots were counted.
We just saw in 2024 another close race, the state Supreme Court race that year between Jefferson Griffin and Allison Riggs, separated by, I think it was 730-something votes. And that lasted for months because Jefferson Griffin, the Republican candidate, sued, tried to overturn the results of that election, have a bunch of ballots thrown out, kind of institute new rules ex post facto. And a lot of people figured that, hey, the groundwork's been set by this very recent case.
And Griffin wasn't even an incumbent in that race. He was just he was a newcomer trying to knock off Allison Riggs, and he did all that. And so people thought, well, if he went to those lengths over months, surely the longtime Senate leader who has all the connections in the world.
More connections, more power, more money.
Will make, Page and the election workers and everyone involved, double, triple check every little bubble. Make sure they're all filled out, the way they're supposed to be. And then suddenly this week, out of nowhere seemingly, we got the press release saying that he conceded. Sam Page.
It was very surprising. I don't think anyone knew that or expected that he was going to concede as quickly as he did it. So the way that it works in North Carolina, we have three different kinds of recounts that you can do. You have the machine recount, which is you feed the ballots back through the machines, make sure that they get counted right. That hardly ever leads to changes, didn't really lead to any changes here. Then you have the partial hand recount where they actually take the physical ballots, look at them, and make sure that, people didn't fill in the bubble wrong or whatever.
Before you go further, that's a bipartisan process. My understanding is they get out a ballot, and there's a Republican who looks at it, and there's a Democrat who looks at it, and then they decide, is this for Page or Berger? All right, we agree. Here we go.
Right, exactly. And the candidates and the campaigns can both have their own people in the room too, participating in that process. So it's very open. I mean, it's open to the public. We were there for that. But you have these processes, and the only way that you can get to a full recount, looking at every single ballot, is if that second step, the partial recount, finds enough errors to say, hey, if we extrapolate this out, it looks like there could be something. And that didn't happen in this race. The margin was 23 votes going in. It was 23 votes going out.
And he had only challenged the eligibility of 13 voters. So let's pretend that he won all those races. He's still down by 10 votes.
Right. Right.
And would probably have to sue to get to get them to count every single ballot, and there were 26,000 of them.
Right.
And look at every single one to see if any of the others were counted wrong. But after 2 recounts, we found that none.
Right, there was nothing. There was no changes. And Berger did try to skirt around the rules a little bit. He said that he had identified like 200 plus ballots that he thought that the state board should check out. You know, it was basically where someone was recorded as voting in the U.S. Senate race in this district, but not in this state Senate race. And so he said, hey, this is suspicious. Maybe these people tried to vote, but just, didn't fill out the bubble completely or whatever. It wasn't counted for some reason. There's no mechanism in state law for being able to just identify specific ballots like he was asking the State Board of Elections to do. And so they shot him down. And he was not happy with that. He put out, some letters about the process, indicating that, he didn't say that he was going to sue, but, used kind of legalese language that you said, oh, okay, this is prepping for a lawsuit. But that never happened.
Right.
He conceded at the Board of Elections meeting where they actually, they had it on the agenda to kind of deal with some of this stuff, and then they didn't need to this week. And the Board of Elections chairman, Francis DeLuca, another Republican, he said at this meeting, out loud, he goes, we dodged a bullet here. Because they did not want to have to deal with some of these really complex legal issues that could possibly lead to lawsuits.
Right. And I think, obviously, we're not paid for our opinions. We're paid for our analysis, but the State Board of Elections was under a ton of scrutiny with this particular race for multiple reasons. Berger saying like, hey, I think you should be doing this to make sure these results are 100% accurate. And then on the other side, you had Sam Page casting doubt on whether or not he might get a fair shake because the state auditor who oversees the elections board is a Republican who endorsed Berger. So as soon as Berger called for a recount, maybe even before he did, Page was screaming from the rooftops, like, the auditor should recuse himself, and everybody look over here and make sure they don't wrongfully take any of my votes away. Of course, I'm paraphrasing.
Right. But yeah, to your point, the Board of Elections was really feeling it from both sides. Both Berger and Page were putting a lot of pressure on them for this race.
I think, and this is not just my opinion, but I think a lot of people would say, man, they did do everything by the book. Whether it was at the county level, super transparent, like you said, even in the hand recount, going to the attorneys and saying, okay, do you see this one? It looks like, it was not all the way filled in, but it's a vote for Berger, yes. A vote for Berger, yes. And none of that led to any changes. And,
that's right.
We didn't receive any protests. We didn't see Berger protest any of their interpretations. He protested the eligibility of voters, but he never said, hey, you counted this for Page. But really, if you look at the bubble, it's, we didn't really see any of that.
Right, and Berger had filed a few formal protests, saying that, the rules weren't followed in X, Y, and Z instances. But he, even if every single allegation that he made was accurate, and even if every single one of those instances went against him, it still wouldn't have been enough because there was such a small number. It wouldn't have been enough to make a change. So I think, for people who are concerned about election integrity issues, are, have some distrust in the process, I think the just huge microscope that this race was under showed that it went pretty smoothly in the end. There were some potential hiccups along the way, yes. But, even if, again, all of those hiccups were actually real, which we don't know if they were because the protests are now gone, they still wouldn't have made a difference, even in this incredibly razor-thin margin race.
Yeah, and they are vindicated. Whether it's the Rockingham County election workers or the Board of Elections, on which the Rockingham County Board of Elections chairman is someone who has donated to Phil Berger in the past. But he and the rest of his board were open about this process. And in Guilford County, it was the same way. So if you're someone who is skeptical about how ballots are counted, I mean, like you said, I can't think of another race that was under more scrutiny or a time where these election workers at the county and state level were under more pressure and the margin did not change.
Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, We'll hear more about the election process in North Carolina. Stick around.
That's right. And it was such a thin margin that, again, even a couple dozen mistakes could have flipped this race, and those just didn't exist. Nobody found them. We spent weeks looking for them. Both sides had lawyers on the case looking for these things. Nothing happened. Nothing materialized from it.
Personal opinion, in the grand scheme of things, that's sort of amazing to me, given that there were 26,000 ballots, and you just never know when there's going to be, a tabulator that jams, or people wrongly fill out the bubble wrong or something like that. It's amazing. I hope all these election workers get the praise they deserve.
Yes, they won't, but we'll give them a little bit right here on this this recording. All right, listen, we have talked about the postmortem on this enough. We have some other YouTube videos up on it too if you want to track those down on our page, looking kind of how this happened, where this groundswell came from against Berger. But guess what? He lost, but he's not out of office yet.
No.
He doesn't leave office until January. And the legislature comes back to Raleigh in April, just a couple weeks from when we're recording this right now. And they've got a lot on their plate, don't they?
Right. They did not pass a budget, a state spending plan for the current fiscal year. And that fiscal year started last, July or August?
Yeah, July
and so
1.
We're
9 months in.
Operating with the budget that we had from 2024?
It was actually first passed in 2023.
Yeah.
And then they tweaked it a little in 2024. It's now 2026.
And one thing to know about that is that in the meantime, other states have passed budgets. Other states have passed raises for their state employees. And we've seen at legislative committees down at Raleigh, not far from our station, where agency leaders, whether it's, the Department of Public Safety, they're called something else now, but that's what they are, or the teachers, or all these other people have come, and Highway Patrol have said, our salaries are too low, we're losing people, we need raises.
Yeah, especially in some of the border counties. They're saying, look, I have a prison in northeastern North Carolina, but all of my guards are quitting because they can just go across the line to Virginia and make a ton more money.
Right, so this is in the background, as these lawmakers prepare to come back, but we haven't had a state budget, in part because Berger and House Speaker Destin Hall, who also a Republican, have disagreed on a number of things, from the tax rate to spending on Medicaid to spending on a children's hospital, and that's why these raises haven't been passed as some sort of comprehensive plan. They've been at a stalemate.
It's going to be really interesting to see what Berger's loss does for these budget negotiations, because yes, we are already 9 months past our deadline to have done this. We're actually coming up on the next budget year, and we still have nothing. So the question is, okay, he knows that this is, in all likelihood, we don't know for sure, but probably the end of his political career. It's at least his last guaranteed shot to do stuff, to make new policy, to enact new laws here in North Carolina. So, does that make him more engaged to get a budget passed, or does he not want to potentially roll back some of the tax cuts, which is what the House wants to do? And so
they want to pause them. I don't know if they want to roll them back.
Right.
They want to pause them.
Yes, they'll get on me for that. So right now, under current law, North Carolina has tax cuts planned to go into effect year after year after year. But the state's budget analysts say, hey, those are getting too aggressive. They've been fine the last 15 years, but we've kind of finally hit that point where we're actually going to start running into deficits. We, potentially have to cut state spending because guess what, North Carolina, we can't do deficit spending like the federal government does. If we have a deficit, you got to either raise taxes or cut spending.
And in the meantime, we're one of the fastest growing states in the country. So our population is going up, and our tax revenues are, if a lot of these cuts go into place, will go down.
Yeah,
so
dropping by hundreds of millions of dollars as soon as July, according to the latest numbers that we got.
Right.
And so, Berger has spent his entire nearly 30-year career at the legislature advocating for tax cuts. I mean, that has been probably his biggest legacy. As soon as Republicans took power in 2011, the first thing that they did was completely rewrite the state's tax code. They've continuously cut taxes since then. So,
and they take
now
credit. They say we're on those lists of best places for business or to live because the personal income tax rate is low and the corporate and the corporate tax rate's low. They take credit for all that. And so when you see us on those like top places lists, whether it's Forbes or whatever, Berger, that's what he and the other Republicans consider one of their major accomplishments.
That's right. But now that we have these warnings from the legislature's own analysts about these deficits and big spending cuts that are coming, the House wants to, shall we say, pump the brakes on some of those cuts and say, okay, let's just freeze it where we are now. And, if the revenues, go up enough, we can put them back in the future. But at least for right now, while we're looking at this, potential fiscal cliff situation, let's just keep it like it is, not raise any of the rates, but just not continue cutting the rates. And so, does Berger have to agree to that in order to get anything else that he might want in the budget, like the State Children's Hospital, which he, that's been a big project of his, kind of a passion project. He thinks it's really important. A lot of Senate Republicans also think it's really important. They've spoken about their own children's, medical issues that have forced them to go to other states, and they question, why don't we have something in North Carolina, like they have in Ohio, Virginia, Florida, other big states, specifically dedicated for children. And so, that's an example of a really big project that Berger wants. The House isn't so hot on, but then the House wants to freeze the tax cuts. Berger presumably does not have much interest in freezing those tax cuts. So do you reach a situation where they can, find some middle ground here, make some deals, or does everyone just kind of let this stalemate play out until January when we have a new Senate leader in place, someone else leading the caucus, leading the negotiations, and just go, another year with no budget?
Right. I imagine Berger's in his 70s? And this is, like you said, likely the end of his political career. He has basically a month to decide, all right, this is it. What do I care most about? Is it the tax rate? Is it the Children's Hospital? Is it Medicaid? Probably won't be Medicaid. But, he has a month to think about what his lasting reputation will be. And he hasn't said. Maybe he has behind closed doors, but we as reporters are making calls and trying to figure out, like, all right, what's going to take precedent here? And, keep in mind, they're not going to work the rest of the year. They come back April 21st, and they're supposed to be gone by the end of June. So really, he has 1 month to figure out what his priorities are, and then 2 months to implement them. And then everybody else is expected to go back on the campaign trail to try to win their general elections.
That's right. And they sometimes do come back for session in December after the elections to make some last-minute changes before new members are sworn in. Because especially this year, Republicans have already lost their supermajority in the House. But there have been a handful of moderate Democrats who would vote with Republicans on some issues, especially kind of pro-business issues. All of those Democrats just lost their primaries. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be much, much harder for Republicans to override Governor Stein's vetoes in the House.
Right.
And
if things go the way they're trending nationally and we see Democrats win more races this year than they have previous years, then, they won't have what House Speaker Destin Hall has referred to as a functioning supermajority. They don't have the numbers on the Republican side, but they've got, a handful of Democrats they can count on for any given vote.
But all those Democrats are gone come January.
Yeah.
And also the Senate, all the Democrats have to do in the Senate is flip one seat to break the supermajority there. They're feeling pretty good about their chances. Just yesterday, I talked to Sidney Batch, who's the Democratic Majority Leader. She said absolutely they are 110% confident that they're going to break the supermajority just given the national trends this year. She said she doesn't think they can actually get a majority, but, who knows? She'll take it if she can get it, but that is probably pretty unlikely. But the point is, if Republicans want to get things done right now that are politically controversial that they expect the governor to veto, they've got to get it done now, this year, because probably come 2027, they're going to have a much harder time, if not an impossible time, overriding the governor's veto. So on top of the budget issues, you've also got these questions of, okay, what else do we do? The House has already proposed a new constitutional amendment to basically make it harder for cities to raise the property tax rate.
That's such a huge issue, too, because we're a growing state. Real estate is at a premium, and so these appraisals come in at the county level, and people keep seeing their valuations go up and up and up and up, and everyone seemingly wants something done about it. The Republicans at the Capitol are like, well, what if we just stop them from doing that?
From
doing that,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's going to be a huge political fight because Democrats say, wait a second, as you're cutting, income taxes at the state level and cutting spending from the state, that's putting more pressure on the counties to fund schools, to fund cops, things like that. So now you're going to also tell counties that they can't do that? Like, where is this money going to come from?
And the state doesn't care. They just know that, the counties will take the blame. Most people will blame their local government for not providing the services they used to.
Exactly. So that's going to be a huge political fight between the Republicans and the Democrats, the cities and the counties, the homeowners, big businesses. I mean, everyone is involved in this property tax dispute, and that's going to be huge this spring. But we know for certain that there's going to be something else, probably a couple different somethings. We just don't know exactly what those somethings are. But I mean, when you're talking about this very short timeline, part of April and then May and June, and then maybe come back in December, I mean, that is not a whole lot of time to get things done, and they could have quite a lot on their plate. So it's going to be a really fascinating end to 2026 here at least on the policy front. We also have elections happening too, but just purely policy wise, this is it's going to be a really interesting year to watch.
It sounds nerdy and wonky, but there's so many millions of dollars invested in these lawmakers and their campaigns and in the lobbyists, and they all converge on our capital city over the next 3 months to decide, how your health care might be affected with Medicaid if you're on Medicaid, or how, the children's hospital, how much funding will it get? Or, if you're one of the hundreds of thousands of state employees, how much of a raise do you get?
Yeah.
We'll learn that in the next 3 months. Please continue following us on YouTube or our website, WRAL.com, Instagram, TikTok. We're all over the place. That's where we'll bring you all these updates and changes to our state policies that affect you.
For all of our recount coverage, go to the NC Capital section on WRAL.com. I'm Jalen Jones, and thank you so much for joining us. And thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and making us a part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news in addition to our YouTube channel and this podcast is the Morning Briefing newsletter. And it's a daily email with triangle news, events, and headlines to help get you ready for the day. Sign up on WRAL.com/newsletter.